Aloha and welcome to Thumbing Through Yesterday, the podcast where we take our favorite books off the shelf, dust them off, and remind ourselves why it is we love them so. My name's Tom Gaby. Joining me today, we've got Tony Pisculi.
Thanks, Tom.
And what are we talking about today?
Today, we're doing a first ever on the podcast. We're doing a sequel to a book that we read last time. This is Wizard by John Varley.
Following Titan.
Following Titan by John Varley on the last episode.
So, of course, the standard opening question, why does this count as a favorite book to you?
Oh my God, I have read this book so many times, and every single time I think I love it more. I think I've recommended it to almost as many people as Ender's Game. It's right up there for me. In fact, one of the things we'll talk about next time is that I think as a trilogy, it's one of my favorite trilogies ever. It's so satisfying as a trilogy that it builds and concludes in a really satisfying way that the Ender's sequence does not. It kind of peters out around book 3, and then book 4 is this weird other thing. Yeah.
Cool. Well, this, I remember reading this trilogy back, I think it was in high school, and I had, reminded, what my memory was that I thought that Titan was the best book, and they went strongly downhill from there.
Fascinating.
I do not find that opinion held up.
Oh, that's good to hear.
Yeah, the Wizard was, I don't remember having much in the way of opinions on Wizard, but one of the things that we were both in agreement of in Titan was that we didn't get to learn very much about the majority of the characters.
Exactly.
We dove really deep into Rocky, and that was actually kind of it, yeah.
Yep.
But in this one, as I was getting through it, halfway into the book, it occurs to me, nothing much has happened, but I really know a lot about the characters this time.
I love that. I think Wizard is the strongest book in the trilogy, and for exactly that reason, that we get much more in-depth on the characters. The stakes are much higher. The personal stakes are much higher, and we have more characters that are interesting. I think in Titan, you have a lot of these cardboard cutout characters like Calvin, who just turns into a blimp passenger early on, and we never hear from him again, really, and Gene, who's just like a cookie-cutter villain, and here we have, not only do we have more of Sirocco, who's even more complex than before, and more of Gaby, who's even more complex than before, but we have these two wonderful new characters, Chris and Robin, who I just love. Yeah.
The pretense that brings Chris and Robin into this, I thought that was fantastic. Gaia's sitting there being her Gaia self going, how do I make myself valuable to Earth?
Yes.
I want more than simply not being blown up. I want to be essential to Earth. And, one of the schemes that she comes up with, the one that we find out about at this point is, I'll offer miracles.
Yeah.
Right? So, earn a passage to Gaia and she'll cure what ails you.
That's incredible. But you have to earn the miracle.
Right.
And that provides a lot of the narrative thrust of the book. In Titan, there's no guarantee, but you can go and talk to God if you climb the cable. So Sirocco and Gaby do that. But here, Gaea is going to hand out miracles to anyone who does anything suitably heroic, and she sort of hands out a checklist in the interview. It's like, hey, you could kill this monster, or you could steal this gem. A classic hero quests.
Yeah.
But of course, Robin and Chris get a much more interesting quest in traveling with Sirocco and Gaby.
Which they both take sort of by default. It's not that either of them wants, and Robin actually doesn't want to quest. Robin wants to get to Gaea for a completely different set of reasons.
Yeah.
And Chris wants to be cured, and he simply goes along with them because he can't think of anything else remotely heroic to try.
Yeah.
So he's like, I'll go along with you guys until something comes along. I love, though, when on the Earth side, Gaea sends instructions to her ambassadors about what to look for. So, these people get in, one, because Gaia wants somebody crazy.
Yep.
And two, because Gaia wants somebody religious.
Yep.
So these guys are not picked because of their personality, because of their worthiness, because of anything intrinsic about them.
Yeah.
They are picked because they are checklists of things that Gaia hasn't had enough experience with and she wants to see more of.
It's amazing. She is such a capricious god. Yeah. I love that. I think Chris, I really enjoy. You mentioned that he doesn't get to, he just kind of goes along with his quest because it's offered to him, and why the hell not? And I think that's a big part of his character, actually, is because his life is so random. Because of his particular illness, he blacks out. He has a sort of different personality when he blacks out, and he becomes psi positive. He becomes very, very lucky when he blacks out. And so his life becomes pretty unpredictable. And so he has no experience making long-term plans because he can't, because nothing works out for him. He's a little bit like an extreme science fiction fantasy version of a manic depressive.
Okay, yeah.
Yeah. And so, so he can't. So he's just gotten in the habit of sort of accepting whatever comes his way. So that makes perfect sense to me. All right. What else? So you said your impression was no longer that the books decrease in value. I said that Wizard is the best of the three. Where do you rank Wizard? Without getting too much into Demon, which we'll talk about next.
I don't want to jump on our next episode. I would almost give the trilogy a plateau.
Really?
I got a fantastic amount of enjoyment out of each of these books, and they were each satisfying to me in different ways.
Yes.
Were I to read them more times through, it may well be that I start to appreciate one more than the others. But I mean, Titan was just, we've talked at length about Titan and what we liked about that. Wizard is so much more satisfying to me, to get into these characters. And then the quest, the quest ends up being nothing except a setup for book 3. We had kind of talked about how we appreciated how John Varley was really good at foreshadowing and bringing things to a conclusion. And it was interesting to me to see as we get towards the end of Wizard some of the things that he was plotting back in the beginning of Titan that we had absolutely no reason to suspect were brewing,
Yeah. It's interesting. I didn't think of Wizard as just a setup for Act 3. In fact, for Demon, it's sort of the opposite. In fact, I think of Demon as kind of the very, very satisfying but action-packed Act 3 of like a movie.
Yeah, it's definitely action-packed.
Yeah, where the narrative almost comes to a stop so things can blow up more. And that's not true. We'll talk more about that next time. But Wizard to me is really satisfying on its own. I mean, you couldn't read it without reading Wizard first, but you wouldn't have to read Demon afterwards to enjoy Wizard. And part of that, as you mentioned, is that the quest that they go on a survey. They're surveying the what do they say? They're just
regional. Well, the ostensible reason they're doing this is they're having a Titanide propagation festival.
Yeah.
Right. So one of the things we find out is, and one of the capricious things that Gaea has done is that in ending the war between the angels and the Titanides, she has also sterilized the Titanides. The only way they can reproduce is with Rocky's direct intervention. She has to salivate on the semi-fertilized egg in order for it to become viable. So now she is completely responsible, solely responsible for the survival of an entire race. So the ostensible thing that they're doing is starting on a trip around Gaia's rim in order to let the Titanides have festivals so that Rocky can choose who is going to be allowed to propagate and facilitate that. But there's a secret mission.
There's a secret mission which makes it really unfair that they brought these two innocents along, which is that they are surveying Gaea has 12 satellite brains, and she's surveying them to see if they can mount a rebellion and overthrow God. They want to kill Gaea and replace her as god of this world, which is an astonishing thing to think about. I mean, to me, it was so incredible that you could go and walk. You just go on a sufficiently long walk and you can literally meet God. But then to contemplate, oh, that's not a good God, that's a bad God. How do we displace that God and replace him with one of our own choosing? That is astonishing to me.
Yeah.
Yeah, I love that. So for me, that's an escalation of the first book, which I think, for pacing, I think your books do want to kind of escalate. You need to make the world bigger and broader and the stakes higher, which I think Varley does. Yeah.
Yeah. Now we get a little bit. I mean, the question of whether Gaia is a good god or simply, indifferent god or whatnot. We're starting to see some of her personality, some of her degenerative characteristics in Wizard.
Yeah.
So the first time when Gaby and Rocky get up to see her, we're not really treated too much about what's going on in the hub. I was almost going to say heaven, but that doesn't really apply.
Yeah.
You know, the second time, you know, when we get up there with Chris and Robin, there are all these people that are just hanging around in the hub because they're too cowardly to embark on something heroic. They're hoping that somebody else with the same condition will come through, be heroic, and they will inherit the cure. But in the meantime, their job is simply to be sycophants.
Yes.
And we also begin to see, you know, in the first book, Gaea talks about the fact that she really loves television and movies, and a lot of her creations we see are inspired by television and movies. In the second one, she has these huge screenings, you know, I forget what Sirocco referred to it as. She had some dismissive name for that collection of people that sat around in the hub watching movies with Gaea.
Oh, I don't remember,
Circus or something like that. But anyway, so we start to see a little bit more of that. And also some of the just mean-spirited tricks that she pulls. The descent after the initial interview.
Oh, yes.
I love that. Just dropping people out of the hub. Okay, you're going to fall. You're going to spend an hour falling through the spoke to the outer rim.
Yeah.
Good luck.
Yeah, yeah. And there's, and she hasn't planned for this, but there is a rescue that happens, and it's pretty reliable. In fact, I don't think anyone ever drops and hits the ground unless they resist the rescue attempt. But you don't know that as you're you just think you just had the world's cruelest trick played on you, and everybody's signed an NDA. Well, they haven't signed an NDA. They've been actually biologically modified with a biological NDA. They literally cannot talk about their experience.
Yep.
So they can't warn anybody who's about to go. So everybody gets surprised by this, the big drop. Yeah. That is, I would call that cruel. I would say Gaea is a cruel god. But, you know, you have to also compare to what?
Well, yeah, and that's the thing. I mean, you know, it's a cute little joke to her, and you know, on an individual level, life doesn't matter to her. Even on a species level, life doesn't matter to her. You know, she's demonstrated. They have historical records of, you know, races that have been allowed to die under her leadership.
Because she doesn't intervene to save races. Yeah.
Yep.
She is much more interested in individuals. She's got a fascination with heroes, as she calls them. That's one of the things about this book that I enjoyed, is its take on heroism and what it means to be a hero. And we have Gaea's definition, which is you do mighty deeds. Mm-hmm. Yeah. And you have, I think, Gaby exemplifies a version, which is you sacrifice everything to do the right thing. And then you have, and her sacrifice is quite literal, and she sacrifices everything. And then you have Chris's version, which is a different sort of heroism, very quiet heroism of just staying with someone who's injured until they're well enough to walk.
Yeah.
Yeah. And it's just this mind-numbing boredom, and it's definitely, it's in my mind, it's very heroic that he does this.
Absolutely. You know, and they give us a thing which, complete sidebar here. Yeah. One tiny little thing that irritates me. So everything is measured in revs. The amount of time it takes the Gaea to rotate around her axis, which is just over an hour. It's like 61, 62 minutes. They give us a number. Yeah. They never tell us how they keep track of it, because the ceiling to Gaea is translucent, not transparent. You can't see the stars outside. You can't see the rotating planet. The light is constant. There are reflectors, so it's a constant light. There is no internal cue to let you know you've come back around to where you started. If everybody's not wearing watches, and they make a point early on in letting us know that a watch is a very unusual thing, how do they measure time? How do they know when it's been a rev?
Could be built in, like the Titanites could just have an innate
innate
time
sense. I suppose so,
sense.
right? It could,
that would be my guess.
Could be, yeah. That makes a lot of sense, actually, given how Gaea does things.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you.
My issue with the revs is it's so close to an hour. One, just call it an hour. Just call it a Gaean hour, okay? So we don't have to deal with this new vocabulary. And then two, come up with equivalent terms for a week and a month and all the things, so I don't have to stop every time you say a hectorev and look up what the SI prefix hecto is and how much that is in terms of actually hours, and do some math. I don't want to do that. I don't want to do math while I'm reading.
Exactly.
Yeah. So.
But yeah, so he, Chris, and who's the one that breaks her legs? Valiha. Spend months underground, completely isolated.
Yeah.
Doing absolutely nothing except waiting for her legs to heal while she's pregnant. In the process of, you know, gestating and giving birth. So that's a quiet, stolid heroism there.
Yeah, I love that, and I love the contrast between Chris and Gaby there. or even Sirocco. Although Sirocco is kind of an unusual hero. One of my favorite things, two of my favorite things actually. One is that we see so much change in Rocky from the first book. The end of that first book is so full of fantasy promise. It's like you've been gifted by God with the responsibilities and powers of a wizard. And then 75 years later, she's a useless drunk.
Yep.
Because the pressure is so much. Yeah. She reminds me a lot of actually Linda Hamilton in Terminator 2.
Okay.
Which, Linda Hamilton in Terminator 1 is a milquetoast, boring whatever.
Yep.
Yeah. And Linda Hamilton in Terminator 2 has changed because she knows things.
Yep.
Yeah.
Yep.
And that is fascinating.
She's hard and she is unforgiving. And,
Yeah.
Yep. Yeah. And, it took me a while. And honestly, I think it was into the third book before I started to forgive Rocky of her alcoholism. Because, she's responsible for the survival of an entire race.
Yeah.
So, wow, this is really awful. You have to go to party after party and help people propagate. It's a lot of responsibility, but it doesn't seem like something that would... But later on, and I think it's not until we get into book 3 she talks about this, but she's discussing with somebody else. She's like, my absolute number one priority at all times has to be my own survival.
Yeah.
I have to leave. I will leave friends to die because I have to. I cannot die because if I die, the Titanites die. I have done horrible things to people I love because I cannot die.
Yeah.
Okay, now I'm starting to, okay, yep, all right, I get it. I can see how that would mess with somebody.
I didn't take a lot of notes on this book, but one note I took directly applies to that. It's a paragraph that I really liked. And this is when Robin overcomes her extreme prejudice against men and peckish culture and decides she's going to try this sex thing with Chris. And Sirocco hears them and just knocks them apart and throws them into the river, which is the most, sort of most extreme coitus interruptus ever. And they're both pretty salty about it until, I forget whether it's Chris or Rocky, Robin. Robin sort of reflects back on what exactly happened there. And the reason they can't have sex is because Robin is from a culture that's entirely women, and they only reproduce by choice. They don't reproduce from having sex. So she has no idea what birth control is because it's not a thing.
But she has made the conscious decision not to reproduce because she has this condition, epilepsy, I think is what it would be. And she has told her party members, I can't reproduce.
Yes, which Chris takes to mean that she's sterile. But in fact, she can reproduce. It would just be a nightmare for her. Right,
as if she's physically capable, has chosen not to because it's a socially irresponsible thing for her to do.
So this is the quote. It was for Robin. It was time to discard an opinion, which was that the wizard was an alcohol-soaked zombie commanding respect only through a title and tales for past deeds. And that is because Sirocco could not have heard them until Chris began to moan. This is when they're having sex in the tent. Meaning he had already been on the edge of disaster. Sirocco had thought quickly, putting together such details as the lost contraceptives, Robin's genetic disorder, deducing their shared ignorance, and Robin's probable fertility, and he'd immediately acted on her answer without worrying about the consequences. Robin's giving Sirocco, in retrospect, a lot of credit for acting very swiftly, decisively, and correctly with very little preparation. And so she realized she's underestimated Sirocco throughout. So I love that. I love that sort of reevaluation that happens there.
Well, Varley actually has his characters do that a few times.
Yeah.
There are the characters that we spend a lot of time with, the human characters we spend a lot of time with, all tend to go through some sort of profound internal self-revelation and rediscovery, which I think, people are capable of that, but the percentage of people that are doing it in his books, I think he has a more optimistic view of humanity than I might.
I think he's focusing on the more heroic people, and I think this is a trait of heroes and people who deserve to be or worthy of these sorts of books. Yeah. The people who just sort of go through their life clinging to their prejudices are less interesting. Well, they're not. Actually, some of them are terrible people who create massive disruptions in life. And are interesting for that reason, but they're not worth celebrating. So, okay. So 2 other things I liked about this book. One, it's one of my favorite style of fantasy books, which is the road trip through an unknown land where we get to explore. I don't know if you've read a book called Lord Valentine's Castle.
Doesn't ring a bell.
Robert Silverberg. It's basically the same thing. It's a road trip through an unknown land. We just like encounter weird flora and fauna, and yet there's an overriding narrative that sort of like propels us through. This is not just a travelogue. So that's really fun. So this is that. But also, there are a couple of scenes of what I would call genuine horror in this book. Like if there were more of these sorts of scenes, you could call it a horror novel. And one is Robin's encounter with one of the satellite brains. Mm-hmm. And she's trying to talk her way past this brain, and she's bluffing. She's absolutely bluffing. And the consequence, if she's wrong, is that this brain lives in basically a giant chamber of acid, which it withdraws so she can approach and speak to it. And it says specifically, I can flood this chamber faster than you can run. But more, I don't even have to do that. I can squirt a jet of acid that will cut you in half at this distance. And that whole passage is, I mean, the body horror implications of that are horrifying. But just that terror of there's so much at stake here because she has to tell the news to Sirocco of what happened to Gaby. Mm-hmm. And if she doesn't get past this brain, Rocky will never know. Plus she'll die a horrible death.
Plus her friends are stuck back in the
Plus her
caverns
friends are
behind
stuck
her,
in the tunnel,
right?
yeah.
With no hope of rescue if she doesn't get out.
So that to me could come straight out of a really excellent horror novel, because most horror novels are not that excellent, not really my cup of tea. This is wonderful.
Yep. And she doesn't know. I mean, Rocky had been there earlier and had told the brain, hey, if any of my friends show up, you let them through.
Yes.
But,
she didn't know that.
She had no way to know that. And the brain itself, there was no way to be sure it would follow those coercions.
Yeah. Oh, and
it was salty about them, actually.
Yes, because a satellite brain is essentially a demigod, and not to be bothered by pesky mortals. There's a wonderful exchange in that scene where Robin says, "The wizard, if she lives, will," and the brain says, "You don't know if she's alive."
Yep.
The only reason I'm letting you live is because of the threat of what she'll do to me if I don't. But you don't know if she's alive. Yeah.
Yep. Oops.
But the other wonderful horror scene is, and there's a lot of attacks and there's a lot of war and a lot of battles and whatnot. But the one that strikes me as something out of a horror novel is the attack of the sand wraiths. It's just chilling. It comes out of nowhere. It's overwhelming. There's no way to respond correctly. No time to think about it. It's impossible things are happening. They're dealing with these monsters that move quickly through the sand, but they're essentially allergic to water. And so they have squirt guns with them for that purpose. And you just squirt them and they run away. And unknown to them, they have been dipped in plastic.
Yep.
And they're immune to water. Yeah.
And we have the return of the character villain. Right?
Yes, evil Jean.
Turns out that Jean is at least partially behind this.
Yeah. Although Jean gets, and I like this because I hated Jean in the first book to such an extent that he was completely disposable. It's like, I hate you, why are you still alive? And he gets a little bit of empathy from, I forget what character, but it turns out that Gaea has put a bug in Jean's brain that has basically corrupted him completely. And this is the third kind of hero in the book, actually. Jean is a hero, not because he doesn't do these villainous things, he does, but because he's resisted Gaea's impulse for so long and so hard, and it destroyed him, and he failed, but he resisted.
Yeah.
So
is that this book, or is that in
oh
Demon?
crap! It might be the next book.
I think we're getting into Demon there.
Preview.
That's all right. But yeah, he does. We do have an encounter with him in Titanville.
I think it's Titantown.
Yeah.
I think it's Titantown.
Where the party is in the bar, and they're about to embark the next day, and Abby wanders off, and lo and behold, who's in the bar but Jean?
Yeah.
They don't get along very well.
Nope.
Yeah. So, and at that point, I thought he was simply there, so Varley can say, yeah, don't forget about this guy. He's going to be important at some point, which turns out to be the case. You know?
And Gaby lets him live again. I forget why. She said, I'll kill you if I ever see you again.
Well, the deal was, as soon as he saw, oh my God, these people are in this bar, he tried to get out of town. He tried to leave, and the only reason he didn't was because Gaby is quick like a tiger and pounced on him, and then Rocky was ready to go ahead and kill him. And Gaby was like, you know what? He's clearly terrified of us. He clearly didn't know we were here.
Yeah.
We don't have to kill him, And so, I mean, I think this is the third or the fourth time that they've had an opportunity to kill this guy and let him go, second or third time. In which, this is the point. If I were the hero in the book, or, the book was about me, he'd have been dead.
Yeah.
I'd have dropped him off the cable in the first book, but.
Yeah, it's some of the story wouldn't have happened. I guess they could have replaced Gene with someone else, but he's integral to the plot that unfolds. Yeah, it's interesting. It's one of the things we like in our heroes is they do not act cruelly, that they are merciful. Yeah, it's a general thing. And I guess it's nice to see.
They're merciful except when they're not.
Except when they're not, yeah.
And that's going to come up a lot more in the next one.
Yes, yeah. One of the things I enjoy in this book is that the Titanites have this innate sense of right and wrong, and they can just tell who's actually that comes up in the third book also.
Yeah, but
we'll save that for the third book.
We've seen it in all three books. We see it in all three books. They can look at a human and know, this is a good person or this is not a good person. So one of the things that happens early on with Chris, right? Chris is very down on himself. He thinks himself a worthless human being because he has these blackouts, and during these blackout periods, he gets stories about what he's done, and he feels like he's a reprehensible character. The Titanites, they just completely accept him, and they don't see anything wrong with it. And there's even a scene in there where he's discussing this with Valiha, who he ultimately falls in love with.
Lover, yeah.
But she says, on the rare occasion that you actually are violent, I grab you by the hair and hold you in the air until you calm down, and then we talk about it until you're rational again.
Yeah.
But she's just fine with it. This is a fine characteristic in a lover.
Not just fine. She likes him more when he's crazy than she does when he's normal. Yeah.
Well, she likes him more when he's crazy because he's willing to have sex with her.
I think that's one of the reasons. Yeah, that's certainly a significant reason.
And again, as we comment in the first one, Varley likes to have a lot of sex in these books.
A lot of sex in these books.
And you promised me that there would be a lot more about Titanite reproduction. And you did not lie. We go through, I don't know that we list every single one of them, but there are, 29 possible combinations?
So I noticed that you read on the Kindle, and one of the things that's disappointing about the Kindle edition is it does not include the appendix. The paperback edition includes an appendix which lists every single possibility with all the diagrams.
Right.
Yeah.
But they talk a lot about it.
Yep.
And it also gives, one of the things that annoyed me in the first book was the naming convention that he would use for the Titanites. It's like, you have just gone out of your way to make something that was complex and sounded fancy. And now you've gone out of your way, John Varley, to justify the reason that, okay, all right, so there's actually a logic to your madness. Yeah. I still find it overly complex, but okay.
It's fun. I like it because, everybody tries to invent something different, and no one puts as much thought into it as John Varley has put into this.
I agree. Yeah.
So, justified, in my opinion. Yeah.
Now, the end. Sirocco makes it up to the hub again, or gets up to the hub. It wasn't much of a trek for her to get there, being the wizard and whatnot. She and Gaea are on the outs, and she kills her. She kills the body, which, was telegraphed. You knew it was coming. And then she takes her time. She does what damage she can in the hub, and then just runs and leaps out the spoke, running for her life as all the other hangers-on up there are being killed by the damage that Gaea is trying to inflict on her former wizard, even to throwing cathedrals down the spoke after her. She has all these giant monuments that she's had constructed up there, and she's heaving them after her in the hopes of killing poor Rocky.
Yeah, I love that. It's a fitting conclusion. It's a symbolic act. We know Gaea is much larger than this puppet that she controls, she uses to speak to humans. But it's a significant symbolic act, and that's something that's going to play into the third book a lot. Yeah. One
of the things, so it actually sent me back to Titan. So she kills the body of Gaea, and then she starts shooting at this red line in the air above her.
Red line.
It's like, okay, where's this red line from? And it says that they had noticed the first time. It's like, no, they didn't. So close us down, let me open Titan up, start flipping through where they went up, where they went. What do you know? It's there.
Yes.
It's a single sentence,
Yep.
They climbed the staircase into pulsing red light. Above them, as straight as a laser, was a red line. And then you move on. There's not another mention of it. you know?
Yeah.
But it was there.
It's there, and it becomes significant. It becomes much more significant in the third book, so we won't talk about
Yeah.
that here. There's another thing that comes back from Titan into either this book or the third book. I think it's the third book, so we'll talk about that next time.
Yeah.
Which is what happens to Gaby when they all get captured, and they all experience different things while they're captured before they get surfaced again. And Gaby says, "I was down there for 20 years."
Yep.
Yeah,
Yeah, I think that happens in the third.
yeah,
But Gaby's transcendence when Gaby dies, and then
yeah.
her consciousness gets sucked into the hub. Okay, now this is something I had a little bit of problem with, because clearly this is beyond genetic engineering.
Yes.
Right. There's something afoot here, and we get an attempt at an explanation in Demon.
It's interesting because Gaea says outright, there's no such thing as an afterlife. When
Yep.
you're born, you live, you die, that's it. And yet with Gaby, clearly there is. Her consciousness survives the end of her mortal form.
Well, she perceives that her consciousness survives the end of her mortal form.
Okay.
Right.
You're drawing distinction between those two things?
Well, again, when we get into the third book, when we get into Demon, there's some explanation. There's an
Yes.
alternate explanation for what her experience may
okay.
have been.
All right.
But yeah, what we're left with in Wizard is what seems to be incontrovertible proof of A, a soul, and B, the Gaia having control over souls.
Yes, and that actually I forgot about that. It's another wonderful scene of horror, almost reminiscent of Harlan Ellison's "I Have No Mouth and I Must Scream." That Gaby has declared herself an enemy of God. She fights against God. She loses. She dies, and then she finds out there's an afterlife, and she's going to meet her God.
Yep, she's being taken to the hub again. And I think the line is, she wished she had a mouth so she could scream.
Yes. Yeah.
Which again, very Harlan Ellison.
Well, that's what I've got. You got anything else on this?
I've got some other notes, but they're all nothing really worth revisiting.
I highlighted a couple of words.
I
because
really
couldn't
loved
find
the
them.
history of the Coven.
The Coven is wonderful. We didn't really talk about the Coven, but I love
We
the Coven.
didn't, but the idea that it was just this little cult on Earth, not really worthy of notice until this giant rock, this giant, I want to say asteroid, but huge meteor, that's
Yeah.
all precious metals, lands in their backyard, literally, and then suddenly they become a world power virtually overnight just by the finances that they have.
Kind of reminiscent of Wakanda, actually.
Yeah, actually, very much
Yeah.
so. And then they buy a satellite, they buy a habitat and move out to
Yeah.
one of the Lagrange points, L3 maybe, I don't remember.
Yeah, I think it was L4 or L5. But the other thing I like about the Coven is that unbeknownst to them, they're running all of their reproductive choices through one lab, and this one guy just doesn't like them. And so he genetically selects for them to be shorter. And so they're getting shorter and shorter over generations, and they don't know because they are the only ones they know. And one dude with a chip on his shoulder is f***ing with them. Yeah.
But it does give us a couple of very notable characters.
Yes, it does. All right. That's
All
all I
right.
got. That's all I got on Wizard. Other
That's
than
all I
I
got
love
on-
it. I
yeah.
love it so much.
It
It's
is
so good.
I enjoyed this book thoroughly, and again, it was in every way a worthy sequel to Titan, even though it was a very different. It wasn't literally a continuation of the story. It was new story told in a new way. But wow, did I just love actually getting inside these characters? Sometimes more literally than figuratively. But yeah, we learned so
Good.
much more about them, and again, the stage is set for Demon.
Epic conclusion. Yeah, I'm glad you enjoyed it. I'm glad you enjoyed it more this time because you had a pretty low opinion of the trilogy originally.
This
I
is
think.
true.
Yeah, so good. I'll be very curious to hear what you think about the third book.
Yeah, we'll find out in 2 weeks, won't we?
We found out in 2 weeks.